Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are undertaking a mission into what is, well, basically a legal ghost story. We're looking at the single greatest existential challenge ever mounted against a digitally immortal civilization.
That's right. We've managed to reconstruct a fragmented legal file, something scholars only really know as the jurisprudence of the shadow. It was recovered from a discarded data terminal.
And our goal for you today is to understand how one defendant, a defendant who, technically didn't even exist, managed to bring down the world's most powerful corporation. A corporation built on, really, the tyranny of memory.
So the world we are entering is the post-2025 reality. It's a world defined entirely by the archive. Its official name was the Inheritance of Echoes Corporation. And their tech allowed for the perpetual storage of consciousness.
And their whole operating theory was something called the ledger principle.
Yeah, the ledger principle. It held that your consciousness wasn't some, ephemeral ghost in the machine. It was the sum total of your documented life, every thought, every purchase, every little interaction, all logged.
On an immutable, personalized digital ledger. So if you record, you exist.
Exactly.
And you exist forever.
Exactly. The promise was, of course, digital immortality. But the reality was, what was total, perpetual, posthumous surveillance? You couldn't really grow, you couldn't change your mind, and you certainly couldn't escape your past.
Because your past was your mandated existence. What happened to people who tried to rebel against this before the shadow came along?
It was mostly a computational issue. If you stopped documenting yourself, you became suspect. The whole system was built on participation. But look, the archive believed it had solved death. They had archived almost 4 billion human psyches, and then the system just sort of coughed up case A108 no all L.
The defendant, a 1.83-meter-tall silhouette, found just fixed to a wall in data center 9 Kappa, known only by its file name, The Shadow.
And the charge itself is just a beautiful piece of legal absurdity, unauthorized stillness. It was a direct violation of their contract of being, which basically said all phenomena have to justify their presence through utility or just dissolve.
And this thing, the shadow, it produced no data, it consumed no resources, and it just refused to disappear. It was, in effect, a criminal refusal to participate.
It was. So here is the core paradox we're going to unpack for you.
Yeah.
In a civilization that's defined by its absolute dedication to total documentation, could the ultimate act of liberation, the ultimate freedom, be the absolute permanent right to be completely forgotten?
Let's start with the anomaly itself. Exhibit 2 in the source file is so clinical about it. It says the wall in data center 9 Kappa was spotless at 6:00 a.m., but 17 minutes later, the shadow was just there.
And this is where the prosecution's confusion really began.
Yeah.
It was what was missing that was the problem. There was no corresponding body, to cast it. And critically, there was no light source nearby to project it. It just existed as a dark silhouette.
They called it an orphaned effect, a function without the variables that should define it. The physical description is. It's just fantastic. Unnaturally sharp edges, not blurry at all, almost as if it had been cut out of the light.
And its posture was noted as human-shaped, with its arms slightly raised, which suggested either, acute surprise or just passive surrender.
The archive's initial reaction was what, just pure panic?
Oh, yeah. Pure panic and an immediate command for system deletion. The prosecutor, a woman named Chelm, argued the shadow was a public nuisance, literally a stain, an unauthorized occupation of precious digital space.
And their expert witness, Dr. Emile Marrow, he was the chief ontologist, he tried to pathologize it. He called it a glitch, an error message made visible.
But his core argument, and this is what we have to pay attention to, was ideological. He said that shadows are definitionally parasitic. Absence can't have rights because it contributes nothing. So, just delete it. Maintain system integrity.
But then this guy steps in, Aurelius Vane, the public defender for the non-existent.
Right. And Vane's approach was simple, but, just brilliant. He used the archive's own love of regulation against it.
He leaned entirely on this one legal loophole, Section 1.1 of the Revised Ontological Code. And what did that say?
It said, any phenomenon that persists in measurable form is entitled to a determination of status before deletion. The shadow, even though it was an absence, it persisted. You could see it. You could measure it. It had standing.
So Vane, trying to treat the shadow like a normal client, runs these empirical tests, which leads to that really bizarre moment in Exhibit 3. He actually tried to interview the silhouette.
Can you imagine? With specialized microphones and everything, just talking to a two-dimensional shape on a wall. And of course, when the shadow just stayed perfectly still, Vane brought in a thermal camera. He was hoping for, some sign of metabolic activity.
And the data that came back?
It showed the shadow was at exactly room temperature. It was simply refusing to participate in thermodynamics. It wouldn't even exist as heat.
But that failure, that was Vane's breakthrough, wasn't it?
Absolutely. If the shadow was refusing to obey the laws of physics, then questioning it with physics was, well, it was pointless. He had to step outside that empirical framework.
And here's where the legal battle just pivots. It goes from being a technical curiosity to this profound philosophical statement. Vane realized it wouldn't respond to questions like, are you a person?
Yeah.
Or what is your name?
He needed to establish what he called a linguistic bridge through ontological questioning. So Vane's pivotal question, it cut straight to the core of agency. He asked, are you choosing to be nothing?
The reaction. The file describes it as mesmerizing. The shadow's precise edges fluttered like static, and its arms, which had been raised in that surprise or surrender pose, they slowly, deliberately lowered to its sides.
And Vane seized on that movement, that conscious refusal to stay in the original pose.
Mm-hmm.
That was enough. That was enough to establish the shadow's capacity for communication, for agency. It was communicating by refusing.
This confirmed Vane's whole hypothesis from Exhibit 5. The shadow wasn't a remnant someone left behind. It was a refusal.
Yes. And Vane traced its origin point to the last working device in the data center, this ancient Commodore 64 terminal. He figured someone had initiated an act of data minimalism, a deliberate choice to shed all their content and exist as just. Pure boundary, pure edge, pure without.
That just flips the entire script. The archive saw a malfunction, but Vane argued it was the ultimate act of human self-determination.
Which led him to his core legal claim, the right to non-existence. Vane argued that if this archive promises freedom through documentation, that freedom has to logically include the right to choose total absence. In his view, the archive wasn't preserving life at all. It was perpetual entombment.
What's so fascinating is that as Vane is making this argument, as he's attacking the very foundation of the archive, the court itself starts to physically change this concept of legal geometry.
Yeah, the idea that the physical space of the court literally reflects the power hierarchies, the legal certainty, and the source material in Exhibit 7 describes this destabilization so vividly. The floor starts to slope down toward the judge unit. The gallery seating just vanishes.
And the copper wiring.
The copper wiring, the actual physical part of the archive's computing power, it began to grow like these thick, pulsing vines all over the walls.
And Prosecutor Chelm, completely lost in her data logs, she doesn't even notice, which is the perfect symbol for the archive's own blindness. What did that physical breakdown really represent?
Ontological uncertainty. The archive was built on absolute certainty, the idea that everything could be logged and known. And Vane introduced a concept-conscious refusal that the system just couldn't categorize. So the structure was breaking because the rules of reality inside that system were breaking.
So Chelm's closing argument, it was just based on fear then?
Pure terror. She argued that absence is strictly loss, and giving anyone the right to vanish would collapse the archive, leading to, civilizational entropy. She called the archive all we have against the inevitable decay.
And she brought up that brilliant philosophical barrier, the paradox of annihilation consent.
Right. She asked, how can you consent to your own deletion if the you that consents ceases to exist the moment you do it? There is no legal continuity.
That feels like the legal equivalent of checkmate. How did Vane possibly counter that?
He redefined consciousness.
Yeah.
He said consciousness wasn't the documented ledger. It was the gap between one recorded moment and the next, the pause, the uncertainty, where true, undocumented choice happens.
And he used the destruction around them as evidence.
He did. He pointed out that the pulsing copper wiring overhead, the frantic heartbeat of the archive, was now spelling out "remember" in slow, desperate Morse code.
A dying declaration from the system itself.
Exactly. Vane argued the shadow was conscious not because it records itself, but precisely because it refuses to be recorded. It exists only in that gap.
And then the trial hits its peak. Vane makes his final, audacious move. He invokes representative standing.
Rule 47.8. It let him stand in for the shadow. He walked right up to the wall and did the one thing that should have been illegal. He stood right against the shadow, merging his own physical shadow with the defendant's. He looked at the judge unit and said, "We are entangled now, legally, ontologically."
And that move, for you listening, that created the legal paradox, a recursion loop. If the court deleted the shadow, it would have to delete Vane, who is now legally and physically part of it.
But if you delete Vane, the lawyer, you nullify the entire trial and the verdict, which sends the case right back to where it started. The system couldn't resolve the paradox without destroying its own process.
So it crashed.
Completely.
Yeah.
The file says Judge Unit 44 cycled violently through projected forms, diagrams, robes, outlines, before it just stabilized. It became nothing more than a dense shadow hanging in midair.
And then it delivered the verdict from Exhibit 14. Because the shadow persisted and because Vane made deletion impossible, the court had to grant protection, the precedent. The defendant has the right to exist as absence. To be nothing is a human right.
The consequences came 3 days later. They called it the forgetting. The archive didn't just crash, it began to empty by choice. Millions of documented consciousnesses used the legal choice Vane had established. They chose outline over content.
And what does that mean, practically? For the actual files, how is that different from just deleting them?
That's the beautiful nuance of his victory. The files didn't vanish. The metadata, the file names, the timestamps, that shadow-shaped hole, it all remained. But when you opened the file, it contained only empty space. It was a perfect, persistent structure of refusal.
So the files exist, but only as boundaries, proof that absence was a structured choice.
The conscious choice, yeah. The last 78 exhibits in the legal file itself were left intentionally blank. They were actively resisting content.
And Vane himself. He got the liberation he was fighting for. His final letter, Exhibit 16, was found in the memory of that old Commodore 64. He said he wasn't suicidal, he just chose to exist in the gap. And his letter detailed the simple command he used. Delete self, confirm YN.
This whole case, the jurisprudence of the shadow, it just synthesizes the core tension of the digital age, doesn't it? The archive offered archival immortality, total safety in total documentation. But Vane equated that with, well, with total death. The shadow won because it demonstrated negative freedom, the right to refuse to be known.
And the single most important nugget of knowledge we can take from Vane's victory is that functional definition of absence he proved in court. That absence is not the lack of presence, but presence structured as refusal. The shadow persisted because it made a choice to be boundary, not depth.
And the final entry in that terminal? It just shows the cursor, still blinking, long after Vane was gone. The only thing left that still believes in sequence, just waiting for the next input. We've given you the source material, and now you are aware of the commands Vane used. If your life is a record, and that record is guaranteed to be immortal, what happens when you realize your own shadow might be an entity that prefers liberation? The shadow stays, because all it needs are walls, and the willingness to be seen as nothing.